Dr. Michael Dickson is professor of philosophy here at USC. His research interests are in philosophy of music, philosophy of psychiatry, and medieval philosophy, and we're grateful to have him here this evening. Thank you.
So thanks, Richard. I just want to say at the outset, this talk is informed by my reading of a good bit of secondary literature, but in order to keep it a little bit not too academic, I'm not going to mention that. But I don't want to take credit. I just understand that some of the ideas that I'm going to give you are not my own ideas, but things I learned from reading secondary literature. The talk is about 45 minutes. There's 5 parts. I'll announce each part as we go so you can keep score. So the first part is called 2 Introductions. This talk has 2 introductions, each one of them in the form of a puzzle. The first puzzle arises from the title, Everything is Beautiful in Its Time, which you'll recognize is taken from Ecclesiastes 3:11. How can everything be beautiful? Don't we encounter ugliness all around us? Not right here, of course, you all are beautiful, but somewhere not too far away, there are some ugly things. How can everything be beautiful? Now you might point to the qualifier, in its time, but does that qualification really help? Does it dissolve the mystery? How are we to understand a time or a situation in which mosquitoes or roaches or dung piles are beautiful? Or you might point out that the dictum, everything is beautiful in its time, are the words of Kohelet, a notoriously difficult figure to unravel. But we can't just chalk it up to the murkiness of Kohelet's perorations in Ecclesiastes. The idea that everything is somehow beautiful is firmly a part of the Christian tradition. We find it, for example, in Augustine's Confessions. All things being made by you are beautiful. You, meaning God, of course. He writes in Book 13. In his work concerning the nature of good against the Manichaeans, Augustine goes to some length, in fact, to convince the reader that apes are beautiful in their manner. Apparently, apes were considered paradigmatically ugly in Augustine's time. And in On True Religion, he remarks that every corporeal creature is a good thing and beautiful in its own way. Aquinas holds up this tradition in his commentary on the divine names of Pseudo-Dionysius. He writes that the good and the beautiful, most of the quotations that I'm going to read are what's on your handout if you want to follow along, or just have them. Aquinas writes, the good and the beautiful are the same, because there's nothing that does not participate in beauty and goodness, since each thing is beautiful and good according to its own form. Calvin, too, writes that God has, quote, so wonderfully adorned heaven and earth with his unlimited abundance, variety, and beauty of all things. He, too, here refers to the beauty of all things, notably not excluding the mosquitoes and the roaches and the dung piles. This thought, in other words, is found all over the Christian tradition, and in fact, it predates it. The pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus is alleged to have written around 500 BC that, quote, to God, all things are beautiful, good, and just. We'll return to the tradition, and especially to Aquinas, but first let's dissipate some of the mystery of this teaching by noticing that the full text of the verse from Ecclesiastes at least partially explains why we would be confused about how certain things are or can be beautiful. The entirety of chapter 3, verse 11 reads, he has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has set the world in their heart, so that no one can find out the work of God that makes from the beginning to the end. The ante-Nicene church father Dionysius, different from the Dionysius I mentioned a moment ago, in his commentary on this verse of Ecclesiastes, instructs that the second part of the verse is an explanation of the first. He writes, and this is true, for no one is able to comprehend the works of God altogether. In other words, while it's true that everything is beautiful in its time, and let's set aside that qualifier for the moment, you and I cannot appreciate that fact because it's not given to us to comprehend everything in its entirety. But this explanation does not dissolve the mystery. It merely indicates why it should seem mysterious to us, and in doing so, it raises another puzzle. What does comprehending God's works have to do with being able to appreciate their beauty? Indeed, what does comprehension have to do with the appreciation of beauty at all? All right, let's set that question aside for a moment, and we'll come back to it. So now's the second introduction, and the second puzzle, this time an historical puzzle, or maybe it's just an historical oddity. The journals of philosophy, art, and aesthetics of the late 20th and early 20th centuries are peppered with articles and book reviews with titles such as, and these are real titles, Beauty Matters, Why Beauty Matters, Beauty, what it is and why it matters. Beauty restored, why does beauty matter? And on and on and on. Why are so many people asking why or insisting that beauty matters? At one level, the answer is obvious. Those of you who are familiar with the tropes of academia will know that academics write papers with titles like Why Beauty Matters because they think that too many people think it doesn't matter, that beauty has fallen out of favor in their particular corner of academia. And they're correct. In the 20th century, beauty fell out of favor across several academic disciplines as well as in the arts. Here's the art critic J.J. Charlesworth writing in 2016 for the Tate Museum. The Tate Museum is arguably the foremost art institution in the United Kingdom and one of the most important in the world. He says, art has become largely indifferent to the idea of the good, in the big old-fashioned capital G sense of the word. Contemporary art tends to reflect the cultural mood of its time, and today any talk of beauty is skeptical or ironic. Art no longer presents a positive take on what humanity might be capable of. Because let's face it, nowadays we don't think of humanity as very good. It's more usual to view ourselves as out-of-control monsters, driven by unconscious impulses to consume ever more, exploiting natural resources in a headlong rush towards the destruction of the environment, the planet, and eventually ourselves. Nothing good about human beings then. Beauty, if anything, we regard humanity as pretty ugly. He concludes that since we see the human world as an ugly place, beauty no longer matters in art. Well, you might have noticed that we've made a shift from the beauty of God's creation to the beauty, or lack of it, of artworks. I'm going to mostly ignore that admittedly very important distinction in order to pose our historical question. What happened to beauty? The story in the 20th century is largely political. Traditional conceptions of beauty came to be associated with forms of political power that many artists, and many of those to whom they addressed their work, sought to oppose. They were deeply wounded by the devastating carnage of World War I, and they were all in against anything they perceived as associated with those who were responsible for the carnage, thus rejecting not only the conventional beauty as understood by the artistic practices of their immediately preceding time, but also the very idea that art might aim at beauty, however that might be understood. For example, the Dadaist and Surrealist artist Max Ernst, who fought in the war on two fronts, wrote in his autobiography, quote, "On the 1st of August 1914, Max Ernst died. He was resurrected on the 11th of November 1918. Of his art in the aftermath of the war, he wrote, "To us, Dada was above all a moral reaction. Our rage aimed at total subversion. A horrible, futile war had robbed us of 5 years of our existence. We had experienced the collapse into ridicule and shame of everything represented to us as just, true, and beautiful. My works of that period were not meant to attract, but to make people scream." With various twists and turns, the art world continued in more or less this manner. By the 1960s, it was simply taken for granted that beauty is irrelevant in art. The philosopher Jerome Stolnitz was struck by the fate of beauty in the 20th century, writing in 1961 that what is most striking about the use of the word beautiful in current art criticism and discourse is not that the term is just one amongst a host of value predicates. It is rather that beautiful seems now often to be used pejoratively or invidiously. The art historian J.P. Hoden put it succinctly in 1967, writing, "The notion of beauty has been discredited." The words that I quoted a moment ago from J.J. Charlesworth echo this trend. What all of them are talking about, primarily, is beauty understood as a kind of feeling or reaction that one might have in response to a certain kind of appearance. Artworks were instead supposed to make people scream, as Ernst put it, or to make people react in various other ways. These reactions were taken, implicitly, to be incompatible with beauty, for a reason that would have been largely invisible or simply taken for granted by the artists in question. Beauty was taken to be, primarily, a kind of feeling. If beauty is a certain kind of feeling, and I, as an artist, wish you to react with some other feeling, then of course I shall construct my artwork to induce that other feeling, not the feeling of beauty. But how did it come to pass that beauty is primarily a feeling? That question, then, is our historical puzzle. So to review, we have two questions before us. First, how is comprehension involved in the appreciation of beauty? Second, how did it come to pass that beauty is seen primarily as a feeling rather than as a property of things? Addressing this second question is going to lead us to an answer to the first. So this is part 2, how beauty became just another feeling. My story is now going to be historical. I'm not an historian, but nonetheless, I'm going to blame the 18th century, and especially 18th century British thinkers, for turning beauty from a real property of thing into a feeling, leading ultimately to its devaluation and demise in the 20th century. There's no doubt that the real historical story is more nuanced and more complicated than what you're about to hear. Nonetheless, something about this story, as I'll tell it, is correct, and it makes an important conceptual point that will eventually motivate us to consider looking elsewhere for an account of beauty. So let's kick off the 18th century British aesthetics near its beginning, and specifically on Thursday, June 19th, 1712, when Joseph Addison, the English essayist and co-founder of the daily The Spectator, announced to his subscribers that on the following Saturday they would receive an essay on the pleasures of the imagination, which, though it shall consider that subject at large, will perhaps suggest to the reader what it is that gives a beauty to many passages of the finest writers, both in prose and verse. He further assured his subscribers that, quote, an undertaking of this nature is entirely new. And while this pronouncement was of course false, there was indeed something new in the series of essays that followed, and it was the focus on the general idea of a pleasure of the imagination, which he distinguished from pleasures of the sense and understanding for technical reasons. These pleasures of the imagination could be occasioned not only by beauty, but by greatness and novelty, upon which he expounds at some length. So what we see here is the early development of a new category, the category of the aesthetic, a category that includes beauty, but is not restricted to it. For Addison, greatness, what came later to be called sublimity, and novelty constitute two additional categories of experiential pleasure alongside beauty. In fairness, Addison does give a special place to beauty. He writes in his Monday, June 23rd essay that there's nothing that makes its way more directly to the soul than beauty, which immediately diffuses a secret satisfaction. And he goes on to describe what we'll soon see as more or less the theory of beauty of the centuries preceding the 18th. However, the subject matter of the discussion has changed in two ways. Addison is concerned not with beauty as such, but with what will come to be called the aesthetic as such, which includes beauty, as I said, but much else besides. And he's primarily concerned with it as something that happens between his ears, as a kind of or an aspect of experience. As time wore on, this concern became a matter of principle. The Irish philosopher Francis Hutcheson set out what would become an important philosophical methodology of the 18th century. Those of you who know me know that this drives me crazy. Writing at the outset of his long book, An Essay on the Nature and Conduct of the Passions, that, quote, in this inquiry, we need little reasoning or argument, since certainty is only attainable by a direct attention to what we are conscious happens in our minds. Hutcheson sets up his inquiry so that his inward-looking alleged certainty will produce the results he wants. In the treatise Inquiry Concerning Beauty, Order, Harmony, Design, so now beauty's alongside order, harmony, design is just another kind of experience, he tells us that, quote, in the following papers, the word beauty is taken for the idea raised in us. In other words, although he will go on to consider the external world as a cause of ideas, strictly speaking, nothing but introspection is needed to address the subject matter as now defined, which, as for Addison, relegates beauty to just one of a variety of pleasant experiences, or as Hutcheson says, pleasant ideas. By 1772, Henry Hume, no relation to David, also known as Lord Kames, was able to assert with confidence that beauty, in its very conception, refers to a percipient, a perceiver. For an object is said to be beautiful for no other reason but that it appears so to a spectator. What followed eventually was all but logically inevitable. As soon as beauty is reduced to one among many pleasures of the imagination, the variety of human experience more or less guarantees that one person's beauty will differ from another's, which will differ from another's, and beauty itself becomes just a name for how individuals react. But it took a while for this result to emerge, for the 18th century British theorists would not allow themselves to admit it. avoiding it by blinding themselves in one way or another to the diversity in our human experience of beauty or to the consequences of that diversity for their theory. For example, in the second edition of his work, A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful, they weren't good at short titles, which was a revision of the first edition intended to take account of objections, the Anglo-Irish politician and philosopher Edmund Burke made the following implausible declaration, presumably in response to some objection that he had heard to his theory. He says, "I never remember that anything beautiful, whether a man, a beast, a bird, or a plant, was ever shown, though it were to 100 people, that they did not all immediately agree that it was beautiful." Later he explains why with another implausible declaration. He says, "There is in men a sufficient remembrance of the original natural causes of pleasure to enable them to bring all things offered to their senses to that standard and to relegate their feelings and opinions by it." In a similar vein, the Scottish philosopher David Hume valiantly, and we might suspect somewhat desperately, attempted to avoid relativism about beauty, despite his general view that it is a sentiment of a person not grounded in any facts about the world. In his very puzzling late essay, Of the Standard of Taste, Hume attempts what might seem impossible. He attempts to maintain, as he had previously, that there are no facts of the matter when it comes to beauty, and to explain how some judgments regarding beauty and taste more generally are really better than others. Eventually, something had to go, and what was finally jettisoned was the objectivity of beauty. The net result is aptly summed up by the English scholar Richard Payne Knight in 1805, so just after the end of the 18th century. "The word beauty," he writes, "is a general term of approbation, of the most vague and extensive meaning." And that's all he could think to say about it. Once beauty achieves this status, once it's just a word that we say when we like something, it'll be easy to jettison from public consideration as soon as there's a reason to do so. And as we've already seen, the pointless and savage destruction of World War I provided just such a reason. There is, of course, a great deal more to the story. I've skipped the philosopher Immanuel Kant, for example, not to mention the 19th century Romantics, but my aim here is not really historical, it's conceptual. The point is that the 18th century British theorists show us two likely, if not inevitable, consequences of turning beauty into a feeling. First, it loses its preeminence, becoming just one feeling among others. The contemporary philosopher of music, Gerald Levinson, for example, who, unlike other contemporary philosophers, at least allows that some good music could be beautiful, identifies the relevant feelings as seduction and charm, which are rather limited in scope and clearly not the only kinds of feelings one might feel upon listening to music. The adagio of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata might, despite its overexposure, have that effect on listeners, but the presto agitato is more likely to excite, not seduce and charm. The second consequence of turning beauty into a pure feeling is that it loses any connection to reason. Indeed, it may be a legacy of the 18th century that our first introductory question seems to us like a question at all. Recall that the question was, what does the appreciation of beauty have to do with comprehension? A common 20th century answer is nothing. All right, so section 3, the great theory. Perhaps then to answer this question, we need to look at what happened before the 18th century. Let's turn now to what the intellectual historian Władysław Tatarkiewicz called the great theory of beauty. The story begins with a legend about the 6th century BC Ionian Greek philosopher and polymath Pythagoras. The earliest known account is from a rather murky figure, a 2nd century AD Pythagorean writer, Nicomachus of Gerasa. Here I'm going to be a little bit of a geek academic. I was proud of myself for finding this, so I'm going to read it to you. Here's what Nicomachus says about Pythagoras' discovery of the numerical description of musical intervals. The intervals of a fourth and a fifth of that which is formed by the combination of the two, known as the octave, and of the tone which lies additionally between the two tetrachords, by the tetrachords he just means the fourth and the fifth, were established as having this numerical quantity by Pythagoras. The method he adopted was like this. He was plunged one day in thought and intense reasoning to see if he could devise some instrumental aid for the hearing which would be consistent and not prone to error, in the way that sight is assisted by the compass, the measuring rod, and the diopter. A diopter is a kind of surveying instrument. And happening by some heaven-sent chance to walk by a blacksmith's shop, he heard the hammers beating iron on the anvil and giving out sounds fully concordant in combination with one another, with the exception of one pairing, and he recognized among them the consonants of the octave and those of the fifth and the fourth. He noticed that what lay in between the fourth and the fifth was itself discordant, but was essential to filling out the greater of these intervals. Overjoyed at the way his project had come, with God's help, to fulfillment, he ran into the smithy, and through a great variety of experiments, he discovered that what stood in direct relation to the difference in sound was the weight of the hammers. This historically unlikely tale, which gets repeated throughout the ages, illustrates the first of two pillars of the early days of the great theory of beauty, namely that beauty consists of some sort of numerical proportion or harmony. Greek and Roman authors, notably Plato and Augustine, adopted something like this Pythagorean understanding of beauty, not only in music, but also generally. Augustine, for example, writes in On True Religion that, quote, "In all the arts, it is harmony." Convenientia is what the Latin word is for you Latinists. It is harmony that pleases, and by which all things beautiful are made one. This idea of beauty as a kind of numerical proportion or harmony has often been applied in various domains. One could mention any thousands of works, from Vitruvius's ancient treatise on architecture to contemporary studies of perceived facial beauty. A second traditional thought about beauty, and the second pillar of the early days of the great theory, is often attributed to the Neoplatonist philosopher Plotinus, who takes up the Pythagorean idea and argues that it applies only to complex things. It takes at least two parts in order for there to be a proportion between them. And even in the case of some complex things, argues Plotinus, beauty does not always consist in numerical proportion. He is, in essence, doubting that numerical proportion fully accounts for beauty. And he asks, what due proportion is to be found in beautiful ways of living, or laws, or learning, or science? Instead, regarding material things, Plotinus proposes that a body, by which he means just any old material thing, becomes beautiful through communion with the thought flowing from the divine. In other words, Plotinus is not the easiest guy to read. In other words, it is beautiful insofar as it exhibits or conveys a divine idea. He offers a helpful analogy. How does the one skilled in building find the outer house to match the inner idea of the house, declare it to be beautiful? Is it not that the outer house, the physical house, if separated from the stones, i.e. just considering its form, makes visible the inner idea? He goes on to extend this thought to immaterial things, but the point as stated here is good enough for our purposes. The beauty of the house, and generally of anything, consists in its exhibiting, in a particularly clear or compelling manner, a unified idea. In the case of human artifacts, that idea is the idea of the author of the thing. It's more complicated than that, but I'll leave it at that. In the case of natural artifacts, the idea is divine. Plotinus' account comes to be described by the Latin word claritas, meaning clarity or brilliance. It'll become important to remember, however, that the thought behind this term is that beautiful things somehow clearly exhibit or convey an idea. Moreover, although Plotinus motivates his view by calling the Pythagorean view into question, tradition does not follow him. Instead, both views are adopted and evolve into what we are calling with Tatarkiewicz the great theory of beauty. The great theory can be found throughout the Western intellectual tradition, right up until the theory's decline beginning in the 18th century. For example, Pseudo-Dionysius, the unknown 5th or 6th century author of On Divine Names, says that beauty consists in suitableness and splendor. The Greek terms that he's using are similar in meaning to the Latin terms. Following authorities such as Augustine and Pseudo-Dionysius, later medieval authors further cultivated the great theory, ultimately stated succinctly by Aquinas. In his commentary on Pseudo-Dionysius, Aquinas uses the standard terminology of proportion or harmony and clarity or brilliance in his account, what Aquinas calls the ratio of beauty. What might be considered the most inclusive and perhaps mature form of the great theory is quickly summarized in the Summa Theologia in a brief side note about beauty, where Aquinas says that beauty has three requirements. The second and third in his order of exposition are repeated from the ancient sources that we've already mentioned, while the first appears to have emerged out of earlier medieval theorizing, perhaps beginning with Augustine's observation that harmony creates unity. Aquinas writes, 3 things are required for beauty. First, integrity or perfection, for things that are diminished are for that reason ugly. And second, due proportion or consonance. And last, clarity, whence things that have brilliant color are said to be beautiful. I'm going to elaborate just a little bit on each of these three components of the great theory. So first, proportion. The natural and original thought about proportion, as we saw, is that it refers to obvious arithmetic or geometric relations, and especially to forms of symmetry. Indeed, many types of artifact, and even many natural kinds, are generally found to be more beautiful when they exhibit those relations. One's mind immediately turns to the use of the golden ratio in architecture and painting, or the widespread acceptance of that same ratio, often in the form of the Fibonacci sequence in natural objects, ranging from sunflowers to nautilus shells. In fact, just last week I attended an entire seminar on musical composition given by a contemporary composer of electronic music, and he spent the entire time talking about the use of Fibonacci numbers in musical composition. However, these examples, as spectacular and important as they are not the whole story, for at least two reasons. First, we're just kind of playing at numerology until we understand why such numerical and geometric proportions convey beauty. Indeed, I think Plotinus could be read as in part making exactly this point. Now, the accounts that we're going to need to do that job are going to be domain-specific. And while there have been some interesting speculations, that's beyond the scope of what I'm talking about tonight. The second reason that numerical and geometrical ratio is not the end of the account of proportion is that the concept of due proportion includes, or at any rate historically came to include, more than explicitly numerical ratio. Imagine, for example, a fugue in which one of the parts dominates the others. Such a composition would fail as a fugue precisely because the parts are out of balance, i.e. disproportionate. Imagine, or perhaps, if you're unfortunate enough, recall a choir in which the voice of a single tenor pierces the air above all others. The problem, again, is a lack of due proportion, and examples are easily multiplied. Proportion is thus important for beauty in several respects. Saying what they are and exactly what due proportion amounts to, what is due proportion in a fugue or a Renaissance mass, for example, that's a task for theorists and practitioners of the various arts. In fact, from antiquity right up through the end of the 17th century, what passes for treatises on beauty were almost always focused on this concept of due proportion as it applies in some specific art or other, painting, music, architecture, and so on. Okay, second, clarity. As for proportion, there are at least two aspects of clarity that are relevant to beauty. In his brief account of the great theory, Aquinas alludes to one of them, namely the capacity of clarity to have an impact, to command attention. Aquinas gives the example of bright color, which is also found in Plotinus. In order for our account to be general, we must not suppose that impact in this sense is in all cases produced by the kind of jolt or effusion that one might associate with bright colors or bright trumpets. Rather, we might say that the beautiful is striking, perhaps in the manner of the brightness of a field of sunflowers or a chorus of trumpets, but equally so in the manner of the serene and muted tones of a Japanese garden or a plaintive oboe. The clarity of the beautiful thus makes the beautiful thing impressive, i.e., it makes an impression. This more general understanding of clarity leads naturally to the second aspect of clarity, which is emphasized by the Platonic tradition, namely clarity as the exhibition, one might say exposition or even revelation of an idea. This aspect of clarity naturally follows the first. If the beautiful makes an impression on us, then there is something, some idea that it impresses on us. In the case of natural objects, the idea may just be the idea of the thing itself. As we've already seen, the tradition is united in its insistence that all natural things are, as God's creation, potentially beautiful. And to anticipate what will be said in just a couple minutes, they are actually beautiful insofar as they exhibit or expose or reveal God's intention, that is, God's idea of what the thing is. Integrity. For the third element of beauty, integrity, Aquinas helpfully offers the alternative term perfection, which in this context does not mean a state of being unable to be improved, but rather a quality that contributes to making a thing what it is. The point is that the beautiful thing is ideally a whole, not missing relevant or available perfections, but also not exhibiting irrelevant or incongruous features. A sunflower that's missing half of its petals is not a beautiful sunflower, which is not to say that it might not be beautiful in some other manner, but it's not beautiful in the manner that a sunflower is. Here we need to offer a correction to a mistake often found in discussions of the great theory. For natural objects, like sunflowers, Integrity means just what the example of the sunflower suggests. A thing is more perfect, and in that way more beautiful, the greater extent to which it exhibits the features or perfections of the type of thing that it is. Now, it's tempting to infer that, for example, a painting of an imperfect natural object, or one that represents the object incompletely or obscurely in some manner, cannot be beautiful. That inference has often been drawn. This conclusion is a grave mistake. What matters for the painting is its integrity as a painting. It should have the perfections definitive of the kind of thing that it is, namely a painting. For example, a lack of photographic realism in a painting does not make it imperfect. Examples abound, from Byzantine icons to the works of Picasso. But what kind of thing is a work of art, like a painting? So here we're going to enter very difficult territory, which I'm going to just mention briefly and then largely ignore. The difficulty arises from the fact that a painting, and indeed any work of art, is an artifact, not a natural object. Like Plotinus's builder, the painter is the cause of the what it is of the painting. I'm simplifying the story. Or as Aquinas puts it, the artificial form. The term artificial here referring to the fact that the painting is an artifact rather than a natural object. Hence the difficulty. If the integrity of an artifact is ultimately derived from the intention of the artisan, then must we say that beauty, at least insofar as it depends on integrity, is nothing more than a matter of the intention of the artist? What if Plotinus's builder designed a malformed house? Would the plan, perfectly executed, produce an artifact that has integrity in the sense relevant to beauty? Or consider the performance of some banal piece of music. If the performance masterfully realizes the plan of the piece, must we say that it has the same degree of integrity as music, as an excellent performance of, say, a Palestrina Mass? In fact, the difficulty is not limited to artifacts. What about quite perfect mosquitoes, roaches, or dung piles? Can we really say that they're beautiful because they are excellent specimens of such things? In trying to get clear about the historical situation, and specifically in appealing to the great theory as an antidote to the denigration and disappearance of beauty in the 20th century, as a way to allow, in other words, that beauty matters, we're bumping up against our first puzzle, which was occasioned by the notion that everything is beautiful. I'm going to skirt that issue for just a little bit longer, because there's one more piece of the picture that we need. So this is section 4 of the appreciation of beauty. The great theory has something to say, and if we look at its application in those treatises on individual arts that I mentioned earlier, it has quite practical things to say about the qualities of things that constitute their beauty. But it would be negligent and absurd to ignore what is, of course, the most obvious fact about beauty, even to those of us who believe, with Augustine, that the identification of it as a feeling in the 18th century was a mistake. Okay, well, Augustine didn't predict the 18th century, of course, but he was aware of the question. In On the True Religion, he writes, "I especially ask whether things are beautiful because they please, or whether they please because they're beautiful. Here I shall doubtless receive the reply that they please because they're beautiful." Hear, hear. But having acknowledged this point, we need also to acknowledge that beauty matters to us in large part because of the feeling that we get from it. Now, what is that feeling exactly? Somewhat surprisingly, at least I was surprised when I began to investigate this question, Aquinas is very helpful here. It's surprising because Aquinas never gives an extended discussion of beauty, but he says enough to suggest an interesting theory. So let's start with what many people misleadingly call Aquinas' definition of beauty. In the Summa Theologia, he writes, "For a thing is called beautiful which, having been seen, pleases." Or as is often more succinctly put, beauty is what pleases when seen. This formulation sounds dangerously close to the 18th century conceptions that we reviewed earlier, but in fact it is nothing of the kind. We've already seen that Aquinas subscribes to the great theory, and in fact he echoes Augustine's insistence, quoted just a moment ago, writing in his commentary on divine names that, quote, "A thing is not beautiful because we love it, but because it is beautiful and good, we love it." So what's he doing in the Summa when he says that the beautiful is that which pleases when seen? In this passage, he is explicitly providing a definition of the sort Aristotle taught long ago is the only sort that can be given for a term like beauty. Here's the issue. The standard form of a definition for Aristotle and for Aquinas begins with the genus of a thing and then marks it off from the other things in that genus by giving it species. The classic definition of a human being as a rational animal is an example. Our genus is animal, and what marks our species off from other animals is our rationality. But as we've already seen, Aquinas avers that everything is beautiful, and indeed that everything is good. There is no marking off the beautiful or the good from what is not beautiful or good, in the same way that we can distinguish the humans from the non-humans. Instead, he can only say what aspect of a thing we're getting at when we call it beautiful. And in fact, just prior to his elucidation of the word beautiful as that which pleases when seen, he does the same thing for the word good, explaining that the good is what all desire. Or in a formulation that we might construct from things Aquinas says elsewhere, the good is what is desired when apprehended. In parallel, the beauty is what pleases when seen. In other words, to call something good is to call attention to its proper power to cause desire when apprehended, while to call something beautiful is to call attention to its proper power to cause pleasure when seen. Before we delve into the nature of that pleasure, which is our final task, let's clear up one thing about the word videre, which is the word that Aquinas is using to describe a thing's being seen. In fact, he's using the term in a somewhat metaphorical or extended sense, just as we do when we say, for example, I see to mean I understand. In the Summa, Aquinas is clear that videre is a kind of metaphor for all kinds of sensation and indeed for understanding as well. And in fact, at one point in the Summa, rehearsing the familiar idea that the beautiful gives pleasure when seen, he instead uses the word apprehension, or apprehensio in Latin, to describe the thing that we do that triggers the pleasure of beauty. Now, what sort of pleasure might be caused by apprehension? Aquinas, in fact, identifies two such pleasures in general. Not only with respect to beauty, but just what kind of pleasure you can have as a result of apprehension. The first is the pleasure of apprehension itself. As rational animals, it's our nature to apprehend things, and exercising that natural power brings pleasure. Most scholars of Aquinas seem to take this pleasure as the one Aquinas is pointing to in his description of the effect of beauty. But that actually can't be correct, he says with confidence. For what then do we say of the contrary of beauty, ugliness? Aquinas says that beauty and ugliness as contraries must have contrary effects. So if beauty causes pleasure, then ugliness causes pain. On the proposed account, this pain would seem to be the pain encountered in the act of apprehending the ugly thing. But no act of apprehension can cause pain, according to Aquinas. He says, for example, in the Summa Contra Gentiles that, quote, the good of the intellect consists also in the knowledge of evil. And in his commentary in the Sentences, he says that in order that the blessedness of the saints may delight them even more, and that they may give more abundant thanks for it, it is granted to them that they may perfectly see the punishment of the wicked. And if that's not enough, in the Summa he is explicit. The second part of the first part, question 35, article 5, is entitled, Whether there is any sorrow contrary to the pleasure of contemplation. And his answer is no. But as often happens with Aquinas, and here's where it gets interesting, things get more complicated. And in fact, he introduces a second sense in which apprehension may cause pleasure. He writes, the pleasure of contemplation can be understood in two ways. In one way, so that contemplation is the cause, but not the object of pleasure. And then pleasure is taken not in contemplating, but in the thing contemplated. Now it's possible to contemplate something harmful and sorrowful, just as to contemplate something suitable and pleasant. Consequently, if the pleasure of contemplation be taken in this way, nothing hinders some sorrow being contrary to the pleasure of contemplation. In another way, the pleasure of contemplation is understood so that contemplation is its object and cause, as when one takes pleasure in the very act of contemplating. In other words, pleasure in the very act of contemplation is not the only kind of pleasure that can be caused by apprehension. The other is a pleasure taken in the object that one apprehends. He echoes this distinction and further describes the latter kind of pleasure later in the Summa. He says, contemplation may be delighted on the part of the object, insofar as one contemplates that which one loves. Even as bodily vision gives pleasure, not only because it is to see is pleasurable in itself, but also because one sees a person whom one loves. Okay, we're almost there. Notice that the concept of love has entered the story. I want to return to that in just a moment. But first, I want you to notice also that we've smuggled in the idea of ugliness. How, you might be wondering, can anything be ugly if everything is beautiful? Aquinas addresses this question in the context of a parallel question about the good. How, it is asked, can everything be good? Aquinas says that there are two ways to call something good. We can call something good absolutely, or simpliciter in Latin, or relatively, secundum quid in Latin. A thing is said to be good simpliciter if it has every perfection that it ought to have. And it's good relatively insofar as it has some perfections or other. Since all actual beings must, as beings, have some perfections or other, because the absence of all perfections would mean that the thing is literally nothing, all beings are good in this second sense. Moreover, they approach being good absolutely to the extent that they have the perfections appropriate to the kind of thing that they are. Aquinas applies this reasoning to beauty as well, although not as carefully or explicitly. But On the Virtues he writes, in order for something to be absolutely good, it must be totally perfected, just as, in order for something to be beautiful absolutely, there must be no deformity or defilement in any part. Now, it's tempting to take this account of ugliness and use it to mitigate the confusion that we might feel about the doctrine that everything is beautiful. And it does, in fact, explain in part how certain individual things can be lacking in beauty by not living up to their form, by lacking some perfections. As Plotinus might say, things can fail to exhibit the fullness of the divine idea of them. But what about those mosquitoes and roaches and dung piles? We ought not to imagine that the beautiful roach is resplendent in gold and silver. That's not the sort of thing a roach is. The beautiful roach is the one that's most roach-like, the one in which the form of the roach is most evident. But roaches are disgusting, so we still have a mystery. All right, let's take stock. I promise I'm almost finished. Let's take stock of where we are. There's three main lessons that fall out of what has been said to this point. First, according to the great theory, things are beautiful insofar as they are appropriate or exhibit due proportion, make clear an idea, namely the what it is of a thing, and have integrity. In short, they are beautiful insofar as they have the perfections appropriate to the sort of thing that they are, and they make those perfections especially evident to us. Such things, we might say, are ripe for apprehension. Second, the pleasure that we take in such beauty is the pleasure that we take in a thing upon apprehending it, a pleasure that is somehow both the cause of and the effect of a kind of love that we have for the thing. And third, all things have the power to cause displeasure insofar as they live up to their author's idea of what they are. I'm going to now set aside the difficult, I've set it aside several times, but it keeps coming back up. I'm going to set aside again the difficult idea of human authorship. It's complicated by the imperfection of human activities and intentions. We can talk about it in the question period if you want. Instead, I want to finish what I take to be the fallout of these three main lessons. And this is a short section 5. I think it's quite remarkable. So section 5, loving all things. That something may cause one to have the kind of pleasure that beauty occasions and is associated somehow with loving the thing is, of course, not only a fact about the thing, but also and equally a fact about a person. And specifically, it seems, a fact about one's capacity to love the thing in question. The doctrine that all things are beautiful is thus not some metaphysical theory that lives in outer space with the other metaphysical theories. That's where I think metaphysical theories should be. It's a kind of demand, or perhaps better, a kind of invitation to aspire to see all of God's creation as lovable, parallel to the manner in which the doctrine that all things are good is an invitation to aspire to see all of God's creation as desirable, as good in itself. It's a difficult teaching, to be sure. I do not find it easy to see roaches as lovable. I'd rather not think about them at all. But
talking about roaches.
I don't think they come up again. Okay. I'm not going to promise it, though. There's only 1.5 pages left, but we'll see. I'll work them in just for you, Chris. But the teachings of our faith are often difficult. Love your neighbor as yourself. Not easy. Love all created things. Also not easy. Indeed, I would say with Augustine, not actually possible for us in this life. So I'm going to conclude by returning with Augustine to Ecclesiastes, with perhaps a little good or at least comforting news. In On True Religion, Augustine comments on Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 2, which he quotes as follows: "Vanity of them that are vain, all is vanity. What advantage has man in all his labor which he does under the sun?" Augustine goes on to point out that the passage is speaking about those who are vain, who, he says, quote, "pursue that which is last as if it were first." Augustine is specifically referring to the problem of taking the beautiful thing as an end in itself, loving it not as an aspect of our love of God, but simply for its own sake, or even worse, for our own sake. But for those who do not make this mistake, he writes, quote, "Matter will not be vanity, but will show its own beauty in its own way." Beauty can be seductive. How are we to avoid this mistake of improperly loving the beautiful thing for itself or for ourselves, rather than as God's creation? Augustine gives us a clue, writing, "When man fell away from the unity of God, the multitude of temporal forms was distributed among his carnal senses, and his sensibilities were multiplied by the changeful variety. So abundance became laborious, and his needs, if one may say so, became abundant, for he pursues one thing after another, and nothing remains permanently with him." I think we can take two lessons here. First, in our present state, we simply are not going to be able to appreciate all beauty. It's too much for us. And if we try to exceed our capacity, we might end up in an endless vain pursuit. Second, to the extent possible, we must remember that God is the ultimate source of beauty. We love and thus may find beautiful the works of creation for what they are, but not ultimately for their own sake, much less for our own sake. We love them in our limited fashion and breadth, as part of the act of loving God, with optimism for a time, as Augustine writes, quote, "when the soul has been regenerated by the grace of God and restored to its integrity." This restoration will have two related consequences. The first is that the limitations in our capacity to see all of God's creation as lovable and thus beautiful will be repaired. And the second is that we will be empowered to avoid the mistake of loving created things for their or our own sake, and instead love them as God's creation. Or, as Augustine puts it, the soul will receive power to possess the world, not to be possessed by the world. Thanks.